Imagine you're in the cold, sterile confines of a psychiatric ward. Imagine you're surrounded not just by doctors and nurses, but by other patients in varied stages of consciousness. You are heavily medicated, and the sedation is weighing down your eyelids. But you can still feel the air around you buzzing, not just from the dull hum of the fluorescent lights, but from the electricity stored in the machines next to you, waiting to course through your body. Now imagine you're trapped here against your will. This isn't a scene from a movie. It's a real-life story from this week's guest, and it's part of the ongoing story of electric convulsive therapy, or ECT. ECT has a complicated and often very dark history with no shortage of villains, like the physician Walter Jackson Freeman, who, in the mid-1900s, aggressively promoted using electric convulsive therapy to render patients unconscious before performing lobotomies. Among the thousands of lobotomies Freeman performed, nearly 500 of his patients died from cerebral hemorrhage and other complications. And this does not count all the untrained psychiatrists who were inspired by his methods. ECT evokes imagery of Jack Nicholson's convulsions in One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, or Angelina Jolie in The Changeling, watching in horror as a patient is dragged down the hall to be punished via electric shock. And have you ever heard the line, "It was a brilliant cure, but we lost the patient"? That's what Ernest Hemingway said about ECT. He received as many as 20 rounds of treatment, but the changes in his brain affected his ability to write, threatening his livelihood. He took his life less than a year later. I'm Leah Denton, and this is Psychotherapy, a show dedicated to providing survivors of therapy harm a platform to share their stories, and to offer language for those of us trying to make sense of our own experiences with the psycho in the therapist chair. Our guest this week is a licensed therapist herself and a survivor of harm at the hands of pastoral counselors, hospital staff, and her own relatives. To protect her privacy, she's asked that we call her Esther. Esther grew up in a small town in the Midwest, the youngest of 6 children in a Catholic family, and not just casually Catholic. Her mother was very devout, so this was the kind of family where they would say a rosary when there was a storm outside. They went to Mass every week, plus daily Mass at the Catholic school Esther attended. When something stressful or scary would happen at home, she could always hear her mother's rosary beads clicking away down the hallway. Esther often felt like all that care and attention focused on religion meant less care and attention for herself, not to mention the fact that a large part of her mom's time and energy was absorbed by her father.
My dad was an alcoholic, functioning. He held down a job for a long time, had a side job, but nonetheless, he was nasty drunk, let's put it that way. I remember lots of arguments between him and my mom, not violent in terms of physical, but violent in terms of words, the emotional violence, verbal violence, whatever you want to call it. So I learned really quickly the 3 rules of growing up in an abusive alcoholic environment, which are don't talk, don't trust, don't feel. Learned real quick.
Between her dad's alcoholism and her mom's religion, Esther's first experiences of abandonment and rejection came at a very young age. And then, when she was 14, her mother passed away after a painful battle with breast cancer.
My mom, I loved her dearly, but she was very absorbed in what was going on with my dad. She died when I was 14. I was told by one of my brothers, "You heard about Mom, didn't you?" And I'm like, "No." And he goes, "Well, she's dead." So I went into the bathroom. I cried for maybe 2 minutes. And then I said to myself, I'll never cry about this again. I'm not going to talk to anybody about it. It is what it is. You know, that kind of stoic building up the wall.
Though her dad did eventually get sober, he still expected Esther to stay home and help take care of him, even when she started talking about college. But Esther's mind was set. Ever since her mother had passed away, she'd thrown all of her spare energy into school, and she was determined to pay her own way through college. She majored in English with a double minor in research and psychology because she loved creative writing and was beginning to develop her lifelong interest in how the mind works. It was also at college that Esther met her husband, the man she's still married to all these years later. After school, they moved around a handful of times, and Esther started working as a medical biller at a community health center. She would watch clients emerge from their sessions, watch how grateful they were and how compassionate the clinicians were with them, and she started imagining herself as one of those clients. She could see that she was deeply depressed and needed support. Her mom's death, her dad's alcoholism and dependence on her, the culture shock of moving from a small town to a big city, it was all taking a heavy toll, and so she decided to get help. With her first therapist, Esther started working through the abandonment she felt from her mom and the traumas of growing up under alcoholism. He promised he would stay with her through the whole process, assured her that he wouldn't leave. But then he took a job at another agency. They'd done meaningful work together, but by the end, Esther was once again left feeling all those old feelings of abandonment. Over the next few years, Esther completed grad school to become a counselor herself, worked in a community mental health clinic, started a private practice, and adopted 2 daughters with her husband. Around that time, when she was in her mid-30s, Esther realized she was experiencing sort of a crisis of faith. So as a practicing Catholic, she turned to a priest for help. And in the 2 years they worked together, this pastoral counselor perpetrated what Esther would eventually recognize as abuse. A quick side note on pastoral counseling, in case you're unfamiliar. Unlike state-licensed therapists, whose purported rules and ethics are established by each state and by the American Counseling Association, pastoral counselors are governed by whatever denomination or organization they're affiliated with. This means the norms and policies can vary wildly. Some denominations model themselves fairly close to the state boards, while others seem not to care quite as much about things like educational and licensing standards, patient confidentiality, and even accountability and oversight in cases of mistreatment. Of course, state boards often don't do enough to protect clients and make sure practitioners live up to the principles and ethics they profess. That's kind of why this podcast exists. But faith can be a crucial part of someone's healing process. It's always important to treat the whole person, including faith for many. And pastoral counseling can be a helpful way to integrate spirituality with the rest of a client's life and their work of healing. But it's worth remembering that it is not, in the strictest sense, a clinical approach. Ultimate authority in this case lies not with any government or state board, but with that denomination's understanding of God. Pastoral counselors usually study theology or religion in school, while a state license requires a graduate degree in the field of psychology or counseling. So in addition to, or even instead of treatments and modalities you might find in a clinic, pastoral counseling often involves things like prayer, scripture, something more akin to spiritual direction than mental health therapy. And the tricky power dynamics inherent in any therapeutic relationship are even more complicated when the counselor is seen as a religious authority. Of course, trauma knows no religion, and state licensing boards can and should do a whole lot more to make therapy a safe place. But in pastoral counseling, in addition to all the forms of abuse that can occur in any other therapy, you have to factor in the potential for spiritual abuse as well. But let's get back to Esther. When she was in her 30s, she hadn't learned enough yet to recognize the abuse she endured from the priest. It was only decades later, after tons of research and insights from another counselor, that she was able to name it for what it was. When she eventually did confront him all those years later, his response was the short non-apology apology. "I'm sorry if I hurt you." Even though she didn't know as much in the moment, Esther knew enough to realize something was seriously wrong in this relationship. When she mustered the courage to bring up the problematic dynamics between them, he diverted the conversation with a seemingly simple question. "Well, did this relationship bring you closer to God?" I wish I was joking. Esther now sees his response as outright manipulation, an attempt to let himself off the hook. But at the time, all she could do was fawn in response and thank him for his help. That was the last time she saw him in a therapeutic context. And despite the abuse, despite his refusal to acknowledge any problems in their dynamic, she was left feeling devastated by the loss of their relationship.
I turned all of my energies into raising my kids. I had no more academics to go after at that point in time, so it was my kids. For the next several years, I was just a great mom in the sense of doing all these things with my kids, for my kids. Worked part-time in my practice, but they were my world. I just loved them dearly. And we did all sorts of fun things together as a family. My husband was very involved. And then, for lack of a better way of putting it, my daughter became very ill as a teenager. Watching her almost die a couple of times, obviously, was very traumatic for me. she survived. It was amazing to see how quickly she overcame. She was resilient. She got accepted, got a full scholarship to a wonderful private college in our state. She wanted to become a nurse. 2 weeks after we got that acceptance letter, she met somebody at a restaurant that she worked at who, for lack of a better way of putting it, was evil.
Esther says this man was narcissistic and abusive, both emotionally and physically. And because of the prolonged illness, her daughter had never experienced any healthy dating relationships. She wasn't able to recognize how harmful he was. But within 2 weeks, Esther was noticing significant changes in her daughter's behavior. The relationship continued off and on for many years, while Esther was also trying to care for her other daughter, who was high needs. It was a very stressful and traumatic time for the family, just one hit after another, and Esther says she eventually reached a breaking point. She was extremely depressed and anxious, and ended up in the hospital multiple times over 6 months. Esther now sees this as a serious case of complex PTSD, but at the time she didn't have the language for that. While all of this is going on, Esther's husband has relocated to another city for work, so he wasn't at home. But Esther's daughter and her abusive husband were living at home. Esther feels as though her daughter has been turned against her by her new husband, and stands by and even participates as this man abuses Esther verbally, emotionally, and psychologically. So a pattern developed. Esther would seek help through inpatient hospitalization, then she would return home to the trauma, and any semblance of progress would be erased. During those hospital stays, the psychiatrists told Esther that she was really the problem, that she needed to learn how to get along with her daughter and the abusive partner. The hospital was getting their information primarily from Esther's family, rather than sitting down with her for one-on-one counsel.
I think if somebody would have sat me down and said, Esther, gee, please tell me what's going on, I think I would have healed or at least progressed much quicker. Because to me, as a therapist myself, nothing kind of replaces that element of compassion, acceptance, validation, safety, all of those things. But I wasn't getting that there.
Compassionate care, listening to the patient's story, establishing safety and trust. All of these take time and effort. When a hospital is already frenzied and understaffed, maybe pumping patients full of medicine just seems like the easier option. Through the course of these hospitalizations, Esther was prescribed almost 30 different medications while the staff tried figuring out how to treat her. The onslaught of meds, according to Esther, felt like being chemically lobotomized. To be clear, Esther is not a full-on medication detractor. She believes it can be a useful part of treatment, but she had begun to feel like a guinea pig, like the doctors were just throwing things at the wall to see what sticks. And then they told her they wanted to treat her with electric convulsion therapy. Esther wasn't sure she liked that idea. She didn't know how it might affect her brain. And given the dark history of ECT, this wasn't something to approach lightly. A quick rundown. ECT involves sending electrical currents through the brain to trigger a seizure, with the hope of affecting brain chemistry in a way that relieves symptoms of certain mental health problems. It has been heavily abused in the past, especially in the mid-1900s, when patients were often dosed with extremely high voltages while they were unsedated, which could result in brain damage, fractured bones, and severe trauma. To make matters worse, ECT was sometimes used not for any medical reasons at all, but as a form of punishment and coercion. Even today, there are lingering concerns about possible links between electric convulsive therapy and suicidal ideation. Proponents of ECT argue that it has been proven useful for certain conditions study after study, and that the dangers and traumas of its past are just that, in the past. They also point out that ECT in pop culture is also often sensationalized for dramatic effects, tarnishing the reputation of what could be a useful treatment. The electrical currents involved are significantly lower these days, and there are more standardized practices around general anesthesia and other precautions. There are still risks of side effects, of course, but ECT advocates argue that the risks are outweighed by potential benefits for certain conditions when it's applied responsibly and with the full consent of the patient. Consent is the key word here, and that's what brings us back to Esther's story.
At that point in time, when it was proposed to me for the ECT, that was when they wanted me to sign the informed consent. And I vividly remember, and quite frankly, I don't have very many memories of that period of time in my life, but I do remember a nurse coming in and just saying, "You have to sign these." And I said, "What are they?" She explained them to me. She read them to me, and I said, I don't think I want to do that. And she said, "Esther, if you don't do this, then we will have to take you to court and have the judge sign off on these papers."
When it came to the question of consent, Esther felt backed into a corner. The hospital saw her family as more reliable arbiters of her situation, and Esther was alert enough to worry about her future. If she refused ECT, what would happen if her case ended up in court and became public record? What would happen to her career as a counselor? It felt like either she'd consent to ECT or everything would get even more messy and out of her control, and somebody else would end up consenting on her behalf. In the informed consent process, the side effects and the risks of ECT were presented to Esther almost as an afterthought. While she was repeatedly assured of the treatment's benefits and safety, in the years since then, Esther's research has led her to believe that the risks of ECT are much greater than she was told, and that the cognitive damage she endured resulted in memory loss, which she likens to the effects of a traumatic brain injury. It's not just memories from those hospitalizations that vanished. Esther lost older, core memories, including some of the happiest moments she'd experienced raising children. In the course of her treatment, Esther endured more than 50 rounds of electric convulsive therapy. I'll say that again, 50. If you do even a little bit of research, it's clear that the standard course of ECT usually involves 6 to 12 sessions, with a maximum of about 16. Esther's recollections of that time, they come only in snippets, but she remembers feeling alone and trapped, like she couldn't express any agency or speak on her own behalf. She remembers being afraid to eat, afraid to shower, afraid to even cut her toenails. But she especially remembers feeling nervous, understandably, the first time she was wheeled into the room for ECT. There were 5 or 6 other beds with no privacy, each occupied by patients in varied stages of consciousness. Then came the IV for sedation. During one session, the staff was having a hard time finding a vein on Esther, so they tried using a needle in her ankle. And when that didn't work, they ended up inserting the IV through her jugular vein. While all this is happening, the invasive needles, the sedation dripping into effect, the electrodes applied to the forehead, Esther said there was little to no conversation between her and the staff. No checking in, no narration of the process, no assurances. Instead, she remembers the psychiatrist, the anesthesiologist, and a couple nurses, all just sort of hovering around and talking to each other, leaving Esther feeling isolated and alone, like she was just part of the furniture. She does remember one nurse, though, who after a few sessions recognized Esther's distress and tried to comfort her, but she was sadly very much the exception. Waking up from anesthesia was a little different every time. Sometimes you wake up hungry or nauseous. Sometimes you've got a headache. Sometimes you're embarrassed to discover that you've soiled yourself. The treatment itself wasn't exactly painful for Esther, not like the violent scenes with unsedated patients you might see in movies, but the whole process was extremely uncomfortable. Esther was relieved when she eventually returned to a level of functioning and was discharged from the hospital. By now, her daughter and her daughter's partner were out of the house, so home felt familiar and comfortable, a haven from all of the intrusiveness and discomfort she had endured. This was around 2014, and for the next few years, Esther was able to maintain that functional level. She found a sense of purpose in raising her granddaughter and working at her private practice, and her relationship with her husband remained a comfort to her. She also began doing more research about trauma. She'd always been drawn to research and problem solving, so learning about trauma and considering its effects felt like putting the pieces of a puzzle together.
If I can attach a why to certain things, if they make sense, then that helps me. It doesn't necessarily mean that it heals me. It just kind of helps me to understand.
On some level, Esther knew there were still unresolved issues beneath the surface. The residue remaining from her childhood abandonment, her family struggles, the abusive pastoral counselor, and the traumas of her hospitalization. Being alive and functional was good. In fact, it was great compared to where she had been a few years earlier. But she knew there was more work to do. So she reached out to a pastor she'd been following online. He was a great writer whose work seemed wise and full of compassion, and Esther's faith was feeling shaken by everything she'd been through. So she emailed him to ask if they could meet. A few sessions in, this man helped Esther recognize the abuse she had endured all those years earlier at the hands of her first pastoral counselor. This was the first time Esther was really able to think of all those dynamics as abuse, as it felt like a light bulb moment. She quickly realized she needed something more than spiritual direction from this new relationship, so she asked him if he'd be willing to do work as her counselor. She was upfront with the guy. She told him that her wounds ran deep and that it was going to take a great deal of time to work through them. She also told him about her past experiences with abandonment, about how difficult it was for her to trust new people, especially men. If they were going to start digging deeper into her past, she needed to know that he was in it for the long haul, that he wouldn't end up leaving her if things got too hard. He assured her that yes, he was all in. There was no way that he would abandon her.
I said, I can't go through another person abandoning me or rejecting me or whatever. And he assured me that he would walk the journey with me. He said, absolutely, I'm not going to betray you in any way, shape, or form or abandon you.
Here again, we need to remember the difference between state licensed therapist and pastoral counselor. This man had a certification for pastoral counseling, and he described himself as trauma-informed. But what exactly does trauma-informed mean? It's not always clear. Maybe this means they've read a few books or attended a conference, or maybe they've worked through some of their own trauma in their personal therapy. And at the risk of sounding cynical, it could mean as little as this person follows a few mental health influencers on Instagram. This might just seem like semantics, but I think it's pretty crucial. Phrases like trauma-informed can sometimes seem like little more than buzzwords unless the person is clear and specific about their education, training, and experience. Without that, how can you tell if they'll have the capacity to hold the messiest parts of your story, let alone the insight and awareness to work through them? How can you tell if they'll know how to recognize dysregulation, or if they know what to do when the past suddenly feels very present and a client becomes activated and unstable? Trauma-informed means, at the very least, knowing that old traumas can resurface in the here and now, and it's important to talk about them. But diving into past traumas without the right tools can be a recipe for re-traumatization. In the 2 years they worked together, Esther's pastoral counselor remained a compassionate and insightful presence. He helped her cope with the tragic losses of several close relatives, and together they started peeling back the layers of past experiences. He helped identify Esther's core wound around her relationship with her daughter, and he supported her goal to eventually be able to process her hospitalizations more fully. The direction of their work seemed clear. Then, once again, Esther felt the rug pulled out from under her.
It was in the middle of July, and he just says, yep, we'll do it. We're going to keep on going, not give up on you. You're not going to journey this alone. 6 weeks later, he's emailing me. In the email, he said, we have to end our counseling arrangement.
He also disclosed to Esther that his mother had recently died, and he needed to prioritize his family, making it difficult for her to feel like she could be angry about the abrupt termination. She was angry about how he told her, though. Email is certainly not the place for such news.
We're here to serve our clients. We're not here to abandon them.
Looking back, Esther believes the two of them had done good work together. She was feeling the movement of healing, and she gained a lot of clarity about the core wounds they needed to address, the directions they needed to go in. These were deep waters to tread, and Esther had only been willing to do so because her counselor kept assuring her he was right there with her, that he wouldn't abandon her no matter what. And right when she felt like they were reaching the center of the maze, he told her in an email that she was on her own. It was like those days when Esther would return from the hospital to the trauma and chaos of her home, erasing whatever progress she'd made. It's not just one step forward, 2 steps back. It's 1 step forward, and then you're knocked to the ground. When Esther expressed her anger about the email termination and told him that this was all reactivating her abandonment wounds, he agreed to meet for 2 final sessions, and they later exchanged some emails so she could try working toward some sort of closure. Sometime later, Esther found herself in a space where she was ready to forgive him for how things had unfolded. She also realized she had her own apologies to make. She reached out and kindly requested the opportunity for a brief conversation, hoping it might facilitate closure for both parties involved. This felt important, not for his sake, but for her own ability to move on. Esther was shocked when she received a return email, not from the pastor, but from his wife. She informed Esther that any further communication would need to go through her. This seemed like a major breach of confidentiality to Esther, because she'd assumed that he was working under the same rules and ethics that she was bound to as a licensed therapist. But again, this is not necessarily the case with pastoral counseling or spiritual direction. Esther has since learned that many pastors work as a team with their spouses, sharing everything with each other. If she'd known at the outset that their sessions were not as private as they seemed, Esther isn't sure she would have entered into this relationship in the first place. The issue of harmful termination comes up again and again in therapy horror stories, and it often might seem subtle at first. Counselors can use technicalities to terminate in ways that look fine on paper. Everything by the book, nothing to see here. But still, it ends up harming the client. The counselor is ethically free and clear with their licensing body, while the client is left feeling discarded and adrift. When you're dealing with complex trauma of any kind, let alone deep issues of abandonment and rejection, the consequences can be devastating. It made Esther feel like she was disposable, a problem to be solved rather than a real person in need of healing. In the wake of all of this, Esther has found solace and some level of healing through books about therapy harm and through online communities for others with stories like hers. She's energized by the idea of helping grow that community and helping spread the word about the dangers of inadequate training, accountability, and ethical standards, whether it's in hospitals, church, or a clinician's office. She still loves her work as a counselor, and she still believes in therapy as a potential tool for healing. She even feels like she's a better counselor now because of everything she's been through. She knows what it's like to be in that patient's chair, and she knows how crucial it is to remain rigorously committed to ethical treatment. But she doesn't think she can ever again expose herself to the kinds of abuse and abandonment she has endured.
I will never go back to therapy. Let's put it that way. Isn't that sad? I'm a firm believer in it because I see with my own clients just the beauty of it. It can be painful. I'm not saying you ever totally end your healing, but you get to the point where, okay, I feel joy again.
For Esther, believing in the potential for therapy, but also believing you can never go back is something to grieve. But she's content in her life right now. She loves her husband. She finds meaning in her work. She's able to function day to day, and she even found her way back to her faith. Because of everything she's been through, she wonders if maybe that's enough. If further healing of those deepest places means risking more harm and abandonment, maybe a wounded but content life is good enough. And that concludes this episode on the Psychotherapy Podcast. I want to extend a heartfelt thank you to our incredibly brave guest, Esther, for sharing her journey with us today. I have found her to be a completely lovable human, by the way. I also want to express my gratitude to our talented writer, Bo Denton, who brings insights from his background as a former therapist. Thank you also to our amazing audio engineers at Peachtree Sound. And remember, you can connect with me on Instagram at psycho.therapypodcast. There you'll find links to all of our episodes and more. If you have a story of therapy harm you would like to share, you can reach out to me directly at podcast.psychotherapy@gmail.com. And finally, if you're a survivor of therapy harm, please consider joining us at Clients Harmed by Therapy. This is a private group on Facebook made up of other survivors who will be there to support you.